Yo, you're watching the Screaming Fish here, people, and once again I'm here for you guys with yet another video, and this time, as you can tell by the clearly very obvious title at the bottom of the screen, we are in the third installment of my series of Star Wars reviews leading up to the release of The Last Jedi, and yeah, I don't really need to tell you. We're reviewing Return of the Jedi, or at least I'm reviewing Return of the Jedi. You guys are just watching. Yeah. It's about as simple as it gets. Anyway, without further ado and without further rambling, let's get into my review of Return of the Jedi right about now. We're here now, the big epic conclusion to the original Star Wars trilogy. The Empire Strikes Back left on a cliffhanger, and a lot of people left that movie thinking, that's it? The thing that that movie did that I think is incredibly smart is that it left people wanting more. And that is exactly what people got. 3 years later. Yep, people had to wait another 3 years for this movie. And similar to The Empire Strikes Back, this movie was met with huge anticipation from fans of the last film, as well as general moviegoers and critics. Return of the Jedi was of course one of those movies that I could not stop watching. I absolutely loved it the first time I saw it with my dad and my little bro, and I didn't stop watching it for quite a while after that. Back then, I would have looked at this movie and said, this is a perfect movie. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it whatsoever. However, now when I watch it today at my age and the knowledge of film that I picked up over the years, this movie isn't perfect. Now, I know some of you watching this view this film as the absolute best Star Wars movie, and that's fine. I'm glad you can enjoy it that much, and I still really enjoy this movie, but for me, I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's the absolute best Star Wars movie. It does have some pretty noticeable flaws, and to start the review off, I'm going to discuss those flaws. So, as many of you know, the movie opens up with Darth Vader coming out of his shuttle and basically walking into a new Death Star. Yup, that's right, the Empire have gone and built a new Death Star. Now, while this new Death Star looks cool in its design, I can't really get my head around why the Empire would build a second Death Star considering it didn't work out so well the first time. I also don't think we really needed a second Death Star. It seemed pretty unoriginal, and if I'm honest, it felt like the writers just couldn't think of anything else to make the Empire more intimidating, even though in the last movie, they didn't even need the Death Star, and in that movie they were more intimidating than they ever have been. This movie is also a lot more reliant on exposition than the last two movies were, and at times it can really feel like the filmmakers were afraid that the audience wouldn't understand things unless someone like C-3PO blatantly pointed them out. For example, when R2 and 3PO are in Jabba's palace, Jabba says the line, "I like Solo where he is," and that clearly gives you the information that you need to know, but then C-3PO immediately responds with pointing out the obvious and saying, "Look, it's Captain Solo, and he's still frozen in carbonate." And I'm just sitting there thinking, yeah, we already know that. And unfortunately, there are quite a few scenes in Return of the Jedi that are like that. To be honest, I also didn't really find myself all that invested in the second act of the film. There were plenty of great character moments and scenes, but my major issue really is the Ewoks. I just feel that while they are adorable, they didn't really need to be in the movie at all. Their whole inclusion in the second act just doesn't feel like it should be in the film at all. They don't really further the plot or further develop anything, they're just there purely so Lucas can sell toys. Yes, I know they contribute heavily in the final battle of the movie, but other than that, these guys really don't serve any purpose towards the plot. Anyway, back to Jabba's palace. Aside from the undeniably forced exposition in the first 20 to 30 minutes of the film, I still really enjoy it. There are a lot of really entertaining sequences, such as the scene where Luke falls through the trapdoor and is up to fight this huge monster called the Rancor. And speaking of the Rancor, this thing is incredible. The Rancor is one of the greatest practical creatures I've ever seen. Out of all the incredible aliens and creatures we are introduced to in the original trilogy, the Rancor is one of my favourites. It looks real, it's scary as hell, and the attention to detail on this thing is staggering. I also gotta say that Jabba the Hutt himself, I'm amazed that he is a puppet. I can look at him and say that he is a real, living creature. I also love the sequence following the Rancor pit where Luke and Co are about to be thrown in a Sarlacc pit. I always get chills when Luke gives a signal for R2 to give him his lightsaber, and you can also imagine my surprise when I realised that Luke's new lightsaber is actually green. It's great to see that there's actually some sort of variety in terms of what colour a lightsaber can be. It's awesome seeing a lightsaber being used in an action sequence that isn't a lightsaber duel. Not that lightsaber duels are bad or anything, believe me, they're awesome. It's just cool seeing Luke deflecting lasers with it and chopping speeders in half. However, I really hate what they did with Boba Fett in this movie. Boba Fett is in this movie a lot more than he was in the last movie, and that's great, because I think he is an awesome character. It's just the way in which he exits this movie. He literally gets his jetpack accidentally busted by a blind Han Solo, and then ends up falling into the Sarlacc pit. and that's the last we ever see of him. He doesn't even get any time to shine before that happens either, so that in itself is pretty disappointing. So after our heroes rescue Han from Jabba, Luke heads back to Dagobah to try and complete his training, and this of course leads to one of the most emotional scenes in the entire saga. Yoda's death in this movie is one of the saddest scenes in a movie that I have ever had to sit through. It's heartbreaking seeing this amazing character on the verge of death, and when he actually dies, it's just as impactful. This is followed by Luke having a chat with Obi-Wan, who of course at this point is a Force ghost, and this, as you know, is a scene where we find out that Leia is in fact Luke's sister. I do think it's a cool twist, and it does add a lot more depth to the dynamic between Luke and Leia, but it does make their romantic interaction than the last two films feel very awkward and in some cases uncomfortable. I can't watch the scene in The Empire Strikes Back where Leia kisses Luke on the lips without thinking, oh god. After what I would say was a pretty compelling conversation between Luke and Obi-Wan, the film cuts to the rebels preparing for their attack on the second Death Star. I love seeing all the cool rebel ships and X-Wings flying about, the effects are fantastic, and I love the designs of these ships. However, when Lando and Han finally get the chance to talk with each other in this scene, they're best buddies again. Han doesn't even seem remotely angry at Lando, despite the fact that in the last movie, Lando is the reason he was frozen in carbonate. It just feels off and out of place that these two are all of a sudden friends again. One of my favourite scenes in this movie is where they're all in the stolen Imperial shuttle, and as they move past the Star Destroyer, Luke begins to feel Vader's presence. I love this scene because of the tension that builds as the scene progresses. He knows that he's endangering the mission just by being there on that shuttle because of his link to Vader, and some very dark things are foreshadowed in the look on Luke's face throughout the scene. The forest moon of Endor is one of the most beautiful planets in the Star Wars universe. It is basically a giant forest, but it's very hard not to appreciate its beauty as a location in this huge universe. The speeder bike chase that takes place here is one of the most entertaining action sequences in the Star Wars universe. I have a blast every time I watch this sequence, not just because it's generally fun, but also because of how well made it is. The blue screen effects used here are virtually flawless in my eyes. There's never an effect here that stands out as being dated or even mediocre for the time, and the same can be said for the amazing space battles. This movie has one of the greatest space battles ever put to film. The filmmaking is phenomenal. None of these effects are ever going to look dated because these are all real ships. Similar to the last two films, this movie makes a great use of miniatures and even a bit of blue screen, and it really works. The space battles are intense, thrilling, and extremely enjoyable to watch. Unfortunately, it's as soon as the Ewoks are introduced that the second act started to fall apart a little. Every time there was a scene that heavily featured these guys in the second act, I just ended up thinking to myself, can this scene just end? It just felt like the film shifted focus from the more important storytelling elements to something that really doesn't add anything to the film at all up until the third act. That said, as much as I do think the second act loses some of its momentum, there are still a few interesting scenes here. I particularly found myself engaged in a scene where Luke tells Leia that he is her brother and that he feels he needs to at least try to turn Darth Vader back into the good man he once was. That is a really hard-hitting scene that really hits you emotionally. The movie finally decides to get going again when Luke turns himself over to the Empire in an attempt to save his father, Darth Vader. Mark Hamill and James Earl Jones really do shine in this scene. Their line delivery is spot on, and the scene really does a great job at setting up the inevitable final confrontation between Luke and Vader. I also love how at the end of the scene, Darth Vader just looks over the forest as if he's contemplating whether or not he's doing the right thing by bringing Luke to the Emperor. The final battle of Return of the Jedi is one of the most spectacular set pieces in the history of cinema. Everything from the grand battle on Endor to the amazing space battles and of course the lightsaber battle between Luke and Vader. As much as I don't think the Ewoks didn't contribute a lot to the movie, watching these overgrown stuffed toys beat up stormtroopers is a lot of fun, and like I said, the space battles are particularly entertaining. However, the big show stealer here is the confrontation between Vader and Luke. But before I talk about that, I gotta talk about the Emperor. In the last movie, we were introduced to this mysterious character via a giant holographic head, and in the movie before that, he was only mentioned by Tarkin. In Return of the Jedi, we finally get to see the Emperor in the flesh. Right from the get-go, this guy is terrifying. Ian McDiarmid knocks this role out of the park. Everything about this character gives me chills. His voice, the way he looks, the immense power over the Force he wields, and even the hold he has on Darth Vader. I love every minute of screen time that this guy has. He is such an amazing character. This character is particularly menacing in the scenes where he's trying to tempt Luke into turning to the dark side, and the confrontation that ensues is just as emotionally impactful. I've always loved the lightsaber duel between Luke and Vader in Return of the Jedi because of how emotionally enthralling it is. The Emperor and Vader are trying to get Luke to turn to the dark side, while at the same time, Luke is trying to convince Vader to turn back to the light. While I don't think the choreography is quite as good as it was in The Empire Strikes Back, it's still a very well made and impactful scene. I particularly love the shot where Luke is hiding in the shadows from Vader and half his face is shrouded in darkness, and you can tell within a second of looking at that shot that Luke is in a psychological conflict between the light and the dark side of the Force. I also really like the metaphorical imagery that's in this scene. A good example is when Luke finally beats Darth Vader in a duel and chops off his metallic hand, only to find that Darth Vader has a cybernetic hand as well, and when Luke looks at his own cybernetic hand, he realizes that he and Vader are practically the same in some ways, and when Vader eventually kills the Emperor to save his son from his wrath, it fulfills the prophecy that Anakin aka Darth Vader is the chosen one who will destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. The final scene in Return of the Jedi is basically a big party scene. Everyone's celebrating that the rebels have won the war and the Empire is now gone. And I will admit, it's a pretty satisfying conclusion to the film, but my favourite scene in the third act of the movie, and the whole film in general, is when Luke is cremating Darth Vader's corpse in an attempt to honour him. But what's always struck me about this scene is that Luke is the only person standing around this fire. He's the only one there to honour Vader at his funeral. Luke is essentially the only person to ever see Anakin Skywalker do something good under the guise of Darth Vader. So of course he recognises that he eventually turned away from the teachings of the dark side, but everyone else like Han and Leia will only remember him from the pain and suffering that he caused them. So what makes this scene so impactful is not just the fact that one of the greatest characters in history is dead, it's because that only one person witnessed him do something good. Rewatching Return of the Jedi actually brought back a lot of memories from not only when my dad first showed me this movie, but also when me, Dad, and my little bro would grab a bunch of drinks and food, and we'd all just sit down in the living room and just watch the Clone Wars TV series whenever it was on Cartoon Network. Those were some really good times. Watching Return of the Jedi again for the first time in a while was a really fun experience, and I had a blast with this film. Although looking back on it, while I do love this movie, I don't think it's quite as good as the original two movies. The film was directed by Richard Marquand, and while I do think he does a really good job, I don't think he directed the film as well as the other two movies were directed. I also think that some of the writing could have been a lot better. There was a little too much exposition. That said, I do think this is a great conclusion to an amazing trilogy of films. From the way I see it, Star Wars can be seen as a coming-of-age tale. The Empire Strikes Back is a psychological drama, and Return of the Jedi is just a fun adventure film. I love talking about all three of these movies, the three movies that have been with me since I was 4, and it was great rewatching them. Yay! Now I can review the prequel trilogy! Oh wait, that's not going to be fun at all! So guys, those are my thoughts on Return of the Jedi. I do hope you enjoyed this video. I had a lot of fun making all three of those videos, and I love talking about them because, as you know, they're some of my favourite films of all time. The first two of my favourite films of all time, same could be said for Return of the Jedi, even though I do have some issues with it. But, yeah. The original Star Wars trilogy are, without a doubt, my favourite movies of all time. So, yeah. Not looking forward to reviewing the prequels, but, oh, well, I'm gonna do them anyway, because 1, I keep my promises, and 2, I'm sad. So, anyway, once again, thank you for watching, guys. I do hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, follow me on Facebook and Instagram. And before I go, I would just like to ask you guys, have you seen Return of the Jedi? What did you think of it? Did you think it was good? Did you think it was bad? Did you think it was somewhere in the middle? Please leave your thoughts down in the comments below, and I will indeed see you guys in the next one. So, bye!